Nights at the airport do not feel like anywhere else. The lights stretch along the runway, engine noise hums in the distance, blending with the steady voice of announcements over the speakers. For people working the night shift, it is just another day passing by. For those about to take off, it is a small doorway opening into a different life. Tonight in Brussels, flight LX 789 of Helvetic is waiting for departure to Zurich. In the cockpit, the captain in his early 40s quietly loosens a collar button and takes a deep breath. He has logged more than 10,000 flight hours, but he still keeps one ritual. Before every last flight of the day, he thinks about his family. Only then does he place his hand on the thrust levers. Behind the cockpit door are 29 passengers. A businessman checking his presentation one last time. A college student editing a few lines of text to send to her partner. A mother scrolling through photos of her child, smiling softly. Everyone believes this is just another ordinary evening flight. A little tiring, a little long, but it will get them where they need to be. No one can see what lies beneath their feet. In the cold, dark cargo hold, under a thin layer of aluminum skin, sits a different kind of shipment. 130 boxes of diamonds, sealed, counted, and signed off. A total value of more than $15 million resting silently, looking no different from a few anonymous pieces of luggage. On paper, LX 789 is nothing more than a short hop between Brussels and Zurich. For the pilots, it is the final leg of a long day. For the passengers, it is a bridge between two cities. But out there, in the darkness, along the edge of the runway, there are people who have been waiting for this moment. They do not care about the destination or the 29 souls on board. The only thing they see is the cargo hold and the cold, tiny stones lying quietly inside. That small garden on the outskirts of Brussels was almost silent that night. A dim streetlight cast a weak yellow glow over the fence, and the wind moved through the bare branches overhead. On an old wooden bench, two men sat facing each other, each carrying his own kind of silence. The younger one, called Mr. B, smoked quickly, eyes always drifting toward the distance, toward the highway and the chances he believed he deserved. Mr. B did not waste time. He spoke of armored trucks running on empty stretches of highway at night or early morning, with only a few other cars passing by. He painted a scene like in a movie. A fast car cutting in front, another blocking from behind, a few powerful guns, and it is done in minutes. Cash, diamonds, gold. One move to change a life. In his voice, there was the excitement of someone who had spent too long living with unpaid bills and years of being looked down on. The other man, Mr. A, leaned back with his hands folded. He was older, his hair streaked with gray. On his face was something Mr. B did not yet have. Not a smile, but experience. He had seen supposedly perfect jobs end in blood, sirens, and prison doors shutting for good. He let B finish, then spoke slowly. He did not tear down the dream to mock it, but to pull it back toward reality. Mr. A pointed out, one by one, the things B was choosing not to see. Armored trucks can have escorts. An ambush on an open road would bring helicopters, tactical teams, roadblocks everywhere. Just one driver willing to risk it, one stray bullet, and everything would shatter. He looked directly at B, his voice calm as he said he was no longer at an age to gamble the rest of his life on a high-speed chase on the highway. If they were going to do anything, they had to pick a different moment. A moment when that truck is at its weakest, with the fewest guns, and the fewest eyes watching. Then he ended the conversation with one simple demand. Go find that moment, then come back. Only then would this deserve to be called a plan, not just a reckless game. By day, he was just another meaningless name on a shift roster. A ground handler at Brussels Airport in a faded reflective vest with shoes that were always stained with oil and dust. His paycheck was enough to cover rent, utilities, train tickets, the debts to the bank, the credit card bills, the years of unemployment before this job. Those still followed him like a shadow from home to work and back again. At the end of each month, he recalculated, cut down on meals out, cut out any idea of a proper vacation for himself or his family. He knew the airport like the back of his hand. He knew which paths the baggage carts took, which shortcuts service vehicles used, which corners were fully covered by cameras, and which ones were almost blind. And he knew clearly where the world of the rich really sat. A brighter cargo area, with more locks, more fences, more layers of security. That was where cash, gold, and diamonds were loaded onto planes, flown around Europe, forever out of reach for people like him. One afternoon, after his shift, he met Mr. B near the cargo buildings. A man who dressed better, spoke more softly than the loaders he usually worked with. The conversation started innocently enough, a few questions about his job, about flight times, about cargo. Then it slid into things that were no longer innocent. Mr. B needed to know exactly where the high security cargo zone was, which armored trucks carried what, and when they arrived at the airport. He bit his lip, thinking fast. To him, these were things he saw every day. To the man sitting across from him, they were clearly worth much more. When Mr. B put the money on the table, the amount equaled several months of his wages. He told him about the Brinks trucks from the Antwerp Diamond District, about how they were only allowed into the loading zone at fixed times, about a repeating schedule he knew by heart. He added one detail he had never thought of as important before. The diamonds and high-value cargo were only loaded onto the plane a few minutes before departure, to reduce the risk of them sitting on the ground too long. As he spoke, his voice sounded normal, but in his head, a small question began to echo. What did I just sell? Was it just harmless information, or the key that would open the door to something he would never be able to wash off his hands later? When Mr. B returned to the garden with this new information, the air between them had changed. This time, he did not bring dreams of highway chases, but the schedules, diagrams, and habits of an entire system. Mr. A sat quietly and listened without interrupting. Brinks trucks from the Antwerp Diamond District, the high security cargo zone, and most importantly, the one line that made him look up. The diamonds only stayed on the ground for a few minutes before being moved into the hold. Before and after that, everything was different. Mr. A began slotting the pieces together. On the road, an armored truck is a sealed block of steel, built to withstand bullets and impacts. Every ambush scenario forces them into a head-on confrontation with armed forces. But once that shipment leaves the truck and rests in the belly of a passenger plane, the situation changes. Planes are not bulletproof. Ground staff are not soldiers. They are people working a night shift, thinking about the end of their workday, about a late dinner waiting at home. He told B, very slowly, as if repeating an old lesson. An armored truck is a rolling fortress. A passenger jet, in the brief moment before takeoff, is just a metal bird standing still on a strip of concrete. If they show up at the right time, after Brinks has gone but before the plane starts to move, they do not need to crack a safe or shoot anyone. They just have to seize the area around the aircraft, block its nose, control the 2 or 3 people standing outside, and force them to open the cargo hold themselves. That idea was the turning point of the entire operation. No longer a chaotic roadside ambush, but a short, cold, precise intervention lasting just a few minutes in what was supposed to be one of the safest places in Europe. Mr. A leaned back, looked at B and said, "If we have to strike, we will strike at the exact moment everything is most fragile. Not when the truck is at its strongest, but when it has just become the weakest airplane." To turn an idea into a heist, 2 men are not enough. After locking in on that fragile moment, Mr. A and Mr. B started calling in others. Not everyone was invited, and not everyone invited truly understood what they were walking into. The first recruit was a man plugged into the world of gear and equipment. He was not a great shooter, but he knew where to find something more important. Body armor, duty belts, helmets, uniforms that matched the police. He was the kind of person who preferred to stand in the shadows, saying little, always knowing where the right things were hidden. In return, he did not care about glory, only a clear share of the profits. The second and third were drivers. One was a risk taker, who grew up with the roar of old engines and knew the feeling of tires sliding on wet asphalt. He would be behind the wheel of the fast sedan, the black Audi, pushing the team onto and off the runway in just a few minutes. The other was quieter, more methodical, used to driving heavy trucks, familiar with the feeling of weight and slowness, but also stability. He would be responsible for the van, the vehicle that would carry both people and diamonds. Two more were chosen for a less glamorous reason. They were the sort of men who could stand for hours in work overalls, holding a shovel or a steel bar, and no one would remember their faces. They would play construction workers at the far end of the runway, moving around the site with the invisibility that comes with certain kinds of labor nobody looks closely at. They would be the ones to cut the fence, memorize patrol rhythms, and learn every centimeter of the airport's blind spots. The last one pulled in was different. He had connections in the luxury car world, could talk to people like Mark Bertoldi. He did not love danger. He loved money. To him, this was not a robbery. It was a deal. Provide a clean Audi, properly registered, that could pass for the perfect police car on a runway, then wait for his cut. Each member brought a different reason with him. A search for opportunity, a desire to outrun the past, or simply a hunger to break out of the poor, tight loop they had been stuck in for too long. In Mr. A's hands, all those reasons were arranged into a team. At one end of the runway sat a small construction site that almost nobody paid attention to. By day, a few excavators, a couple of containers, some men in orange vests moved about, the sound of drills blending into the roar of aircraft engines. To passengers looking out from their windows, it was just a gray patch where the airport was being fixed, nothing more. But to the two men playing the role of construction workers for Mr. A, this was a front row seat to watching the whole system. They stood there for days, shovels in their hands, eyes quietly counting the rhythm of security patrols, memorizing which cameras swung across which angles and which ones just sat there like dead boxes on poles. They felt along sections of fencing, fingertips brushing cold wire, noting where it was still solid, where it was rusting, where it sat in the shadow of the construction site's clutter. Slowly, a picture emerged. There was a stretch of fence right next to the worksite where the cameras barely reached. The images were blurry, the signal weak, a small weakness in a wall that was supposed to have none. One cold night, when the airport was reduced to distant engine noise and the pale glare of runway lights, they came back. Same work clothes, same steady walk of men used to overnight shifts. This time, instead of shovels, they carried bolt cutters. Each cut was clean and patient. A large piece of fencing was sliced free, then propped back into place, disguised with a few braces and tape, as if it were part of an ongoing repair. From a distance, it was just one more messy corner of the work zone. But to the 8 people in the group, it was a backstage door leading straight onto the runway. The stage for the heist was being built piece by piece, before the audience even realized they were about to see a performance that was never supposed to happen. To turn an idea into a heist, 2 men are not enough. After locking in on that fragile moment, Mr. A and Mr. B started calling in others. Not everyone was invited, and not everyone invited truly understood what they were walking into. The first recruit was a man plugged into the world of gear and equipment. He was not a great shooter, but he knew where to find something more important. Body armor, duty belts, helmets, uniforms that matched the police. He was the kind of person who preferred to stand in the shadows, saying little, always knowing where the right things were hidden. In return, he did not care about glory, only a clear share of the profits. The second and third were drivers. One was a risk taker, who grew up with the roar of old engines and knew the feeling of tires sliding on wet asphalt. He would be behind the wheel of the fast sedan, the black Audi, pushing the team onto and off the runway in just a few minutes. The other was quieter, more methodical, used to driving heavy trucks, familiar with the feeling of weight and slowness, but also stability. He would be responsible for the van, the vehicle that would carry both people and diamonds. 2 more were chosen for a less glamorous reason. They were the sort of men who could stand for hours in work overalls, holding a shovel or a steel bar, and no one would remember their faces. They would play construction workers at the far end of the runway, moving around the site with the invisibility that comes with certain kinds of labor nobody looks closely at. They would be the ones to cut the fence, memorize patrol rhythms, and learn every centimeter of the airport's blind spots. The last one pulled in was different. He had connections in the luxury car world, could talk to people like Mark Bertoldi. He did not love danger. He loved money. To him, this was not a robbery. It was a deal. Provide a clean Audi, properly registered, that could pass for the perfect police car on a runway, then wait for his cut. Each member brought a different reason with him. A search for opportunity, a desire to outrun the past, or simply a hunger to break out of the poor, tight loop they had been stuck in for too long. In Mr. A's hands, all those reasons were arranged into a team. At one end of the runway sat a small construction site that almost nobody paid attention to. By day, a few excavators, a couple of containers, some men in orange vests moved about, the sound of drills blending into the roar of aircraft engines. To passengers looking out from their windows, it was just a gray patch where the airport was being fixed, nothing more. But to the two men playing the role of construction workers for Mr. A, this was a front row seat to watching the whole system. They stood there for days, shovels in their hands, eyes quietly counting the rhythm of security patrols, memorizing which cameras swung across which angles and which ones just sat there like dead boxes on poles. They felt along sections of fencing, fingertips brushing cold wire, noting where it was still solid, where it was rusting, where it sat in the shadow of the construction site's clutter. Slowly, a picture emerged. There was a stretch of fence right next to the worksite where the cameras barely reached. The images were blurry, the signal weak, a small weakness in a wall that was supposed to have none. One cold night, when the airport was reduced to distant engine noise and the pale glare of runway lights, they came back. Same work clothes, same steady walk of men used to overnight shifts. This time, instead of shovels, they carried bolt cutters. Each cut was clean and patient. A large piece of fencing was sliced free, then propped back into place, disguised with a few braces and tape, as if it were part of an ongoing repair. From a distance, it was just one more messy corner of the work zone. But to the 8 people in the group, it was a backstage door leading straight onto the runway. The stage for the heist was being built piece by piece, before the audience even realized they were about to see a performance that was never supposed to happen. The Brinks truck rolled into the airport under the yellow lamps of evening, looking like every other run it had made hundreds of times before. The steel door swung open, and the guard stepped out first, scanning the area. Over the next few minutes, he and the cargo staff checked documents, signed papers, then began transferring the small sealed crates onto baggage carts. For them, it was just another shipment to handle cleanly before the end of their shifts. The crates were wheeled beneath the belly of the Helvetic jet. 2 ground handlers bent down to secure the chocks, raise the belt loader, and start feeding each box into the cargo hold. They had done this movement so many times, their muscles remembered it for them. One thought about his late dinner, the other about his child waiting at home for a bedtime story. When the last crate was settled, the cargo door closed with a dry metallic thud. The Brinks truck turned, rolling out of the area, its taillights fading. In the cockpit, the captain glanced at the clock. The flight was on schedule. He called ground control, his voice steady, no different from 100 other calls, requesting pushback. Clearance came over the headset. The aircraft was pushed back from the jet bridge, the tow bar released, the ground crew moved away from the nose. In the cabin, passengers buckled up, the lights dimmed. Everyone believed they were just minutes away from leaving Brussels. Outside, the 2 black vehicles had already started their engines. Their light bars flicked on, spinning blue and red circles over the tarmac. When the clock on the captain's panel approached 7:57, when he was about to advance the throttles for the first taxi, the 2 vehicles suddenly burst out of the darkness, swerving hard and skidding to a stop directly in front of the aircraft. The metal giant froze in a single heartbeat. Doors flew open. Figures in police uniforms stepped out, wearing body armor and duty belts, every detail matching the real force except for the eyes behind the masks. 2 of them sprinted toward the ground handlers, hands gripping their weapons, voices low and cold. The handlers were dragged back under the belly of the plane, moving in a daze of shock and fear. 2 more stood under the cockpit windows, guns raised, their look telling the captain that any movement could cost lives. The cargo door was opened again, this time without paperwork, without signatures. The crates that had just been stacked neatly inside were pulled back out, passed hand to hand into the black van. With every crate that moved, a chill ran down the spines of the 2 ground handlers. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew they had no choice. In the cockpit, the captain kept his foot pressed on the brakes, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him, feeling the weight of 29 unaware lives behind his back. In just a few short minutes, a hold that had been packed with diamond boxes was empty. The figures in fake uniforms climbed back into the vehicles. Doors slammed, engines roared. The two black cars spun around and sped away from the nose of the plane, leaving behind a fuselage glowing with cabin lights, but missing the most valuable cargo it had carried. The heartbeat of the airport, used to every kind of scenario, suddenly skipped, and no one on the ground quite understood that they had just watched a heist executed like a tightly wound piece of music. As the two black cars pulled away from the nose of the Helvetic jet, the runway ahead of them suddenly seemed endless. Engines roared, tires hissed against the cold asphalt. Inside, no one spoke. The Audi's driver stared down the line of runway lights, feeling that every second weighed more than usual. They carried on their vehicles the value of an entire lifetime, and they also dragged behind them the risk of a catastrophe they did not truly want. High above, another aircraft was on final approach to that same runway. The pilot on that plane heard nothing more than the calm voice of air traffic control in his headset and saw the neatly lined approach lights ahead. He believed the runway beneath him was clear. He did not know that just seconds before, two vehicles that were never meant to be there were racing to get out of the path he was about to land on. The two getaway cars hurtled toward the cut section of fence. From inside, the fence was just a growing dark patch at the edge of their headlights. The driver blinked once, then turned the wheel, threading the Audi through the gap like a needle through cloth. As the rear tires left the edge of the runway, as the tail of the car slipped behind the steel mesh, the landing lights washed across the sky above. The landing aircraft sliced through the air, smashing down onto the same strip of pavement that just moments earlier still carried the tire marks of the two black vehicles. Between those two movements lay a knife-thin distance. The line between a heist told later with a shiver in the voice and a double disaster none of them were brave enough to picture in full. The outskirts of Zellik were quiet enough at night that you could hear the tires crunch on gravel. The two black cars pulled off onto an empty country road where a few houses sat dark and the trees stood still in the cold wind. Engines cut off and the darkness rushed into the cabins. For a long moment, no one opened a door. It felt as if the whole crew needed a breath after 3 minutes stretched tight as a wire on the runway. Then the doors opened. They worked in silence. The van's rear door rolled up and the dim yellow light inside fell on stacks of small crates, looking no different from ordinary luggage, except that inside was a fortune that many dream of but never touch. One by one, the crates were shifted into the Audi and a waiting civilian car. Each time their hands met the rough surface of a box, a heartbeat reminded them that turning back was no longer an option. When the van was finally empty, they stepped back. A fuel can was tipped over its roof, liquid running down the cold panels. A match was struck, its small flame blooming into something larger that swallowed the vehicle within minutes. Orange fire danced in the night, reflected in the faces watching without a word. For them, it was a way to erase their tracks. For the investigators who would arrive hours later, it would be the first page of another story. As the two vehicles carrying the diamonds turned and drove away from Zellik, the chapter of the heist closed. And a new chapter, longer and darker, called Investigation, opened right there in the dying light of the flames. The next morning, Brussels Airport was no longer a place of reunions and farewells. It was a crime scene. Police tape went up, technical vans parked by the runway. They followed every small trace left behind in the night. At the far end of the airport, near the construction site, a section of fencing hung loose, swaying in the wind. Up close, the cut edges were fresh, sharp, not the result of slow rust and age. Investigators stood there with hands in their coat pockets, taking notes, snapping photos. They understood this was no act of impulse. Someone had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Meanwhile, in Zellik, local police responded to a report of a burnt-out vehicle on a country lane. Under the charred paint, they could still recognize the frame of a van. No plates, no interior left, just a black skeleton and the lingering smell of gasoline. Images from the airport and the burned van soon sat side by side on a desk. The cut fence, the destroyed vehicle, 2 points on a line they were now forced to trace all the way through. The days that followed were spent in dark rooms lit only by the glow of CCTV monitors. In that blue light, the tired faces of investigators leaned forward. They rewound and replayed footage over and over, watching cars move like ants. Then one frame froze. A black Audi, appearing again and again near the high-value cargo area in the days before the heist. No flashing lights, no obvious crime. Just being there, in the right place, at the right times, a few times too many. The plate was zoomed in, entered into the system, and the name Mark Bertoldi came back. A luxury car dealer, living a life far from runways and cargo holds, at least on paper. The case seemed to slow until, in Geneva, a real estate broker was stopped while trying to sell an unusually large amount of diamonds. When questioned, he said they came from none other than Mark Bertoldi. The car dealer's name no longer stood alone on the whiteboard. It was circled and connected by lines to photos, notes scribbled in hurry during overnight shifts. At the same time, new faces cycled into the interrogation rooms. The captain of Flight LX 789 retold that night so many times, his voice grew hoarse. He still remembered the moment he saw guns pointed at his cockpit and the feeling of being trapped, forced to keep his foot on the brakes, even though every instinct in him wanted to get his people into the air and away from danger. The two ground handlers sat across from investigators, fingers laced tightly together, describing how they were forced back to the cargo hold. They carried an invisible guilt, even though they knew in their minds there had been no other choice. Staff from the Antwerp World Diamond Center answered dozens of questions about procedures, gaps, and responsibility. Across the table, the investigators were not faceless either. They were people going home later than usual, carrying the smell of stale coffee and grainy camera images in their heads. They felt pressure from the press, from superiors, and from their own sense that if they could not find who was behind this, the heist would stand as a quiet admission of defeat for the system they were trying to uphold. In those windowless rooms, tired human beings sat facing each other, each side holding a different fear. 4 years after that night, when the runway was shut down, the Brussels heist file no longer fit into a slim folder. It was a stack of binders piled high on the prosecutor's desk, hundreds of hours of recordings, statements, and reports. Europol and police in several countries had been involved. Names popped up across Belgium, France, Switzerland. People were summoned, watched, questioned. In the end, 18 people were charged, 15 men and 3 women. They did not walk into the courtroom like cold villains from a movie, but like ordinary people dragged into a story that had grown far beyond them. Some had been guards, drivers, acquaintances of acquaintances. Some insisted they had only rented out a car and asked no questions. Others said they had accepted a gift of a few diamonds without knowing they were stolen. On the day the trial opened, the media labeled them the Diamond Gang. But inside, they were anxious faces, averted eyes, hands gripping chair edges. The prosecutor stood and laid out the big picture: the cut fence, the burned van in Zellik, the black Audi linked to Mark Bertoldi, the Geneva broker with undocumented stones. The lines appeared, but there were still gaps that no direct evidence could cross. After days of argument and testimony, defense lawyers took turns pressing on those gaps. No clear footage of faces at the scene, no fingerprints on the diamond crates, no recording that captured exactly who held the guns or gave the orders. Eventually, the court delivered its verdict. Mark Bertoldi received 5 years in prison for participation in a criminal organization, providing a getaway vehicle, and involvement in handling stolen diamonds. The other 17 were acquitted. They stood up and walked out of the courtroom under the heavy gaze of journalists and of those who had chased them for 4 years. For the prosecution, it was a difficult disappointment to swallow. They felt they had come close to the truth, but not close enough to force it to stand in front of the bench. For the public, one question hung in the air. If most of the defendants were innocent, then who really stole $50 million off that runway that night? $50 million in diamonds, 130 sealed boxes. All of it disappeared into a cold night on the Brussels runway, and to this day, on official records, It sits under a simple, chilling phrase: stolen, not recovered. Those small, lifeless stones may already have been split into smaller lots, recut, renamed, passed quietly through a gray market to end up on strangers' fingers around the world. No one knows for sure. All they know is that the plane that night left late, then did not leave at all, and the cargo underneath it never came back. Between those numbers are small people swept up in a crime they never chose. The ground handlers have to keep living with the memory of a gun pressed near their ears and the feeling of their own hands opening the wrong cargo door of their lives. The Brinks guard has surely asked himself many times whether one man was ever meant to stand between an armored truck and a plan timed down to the second. Among the LX 789 passengers, some retell the story as an anecdote at dinner. Others avoid mentioning it because the chill is still there. The investigators and prosecutors who spent 4 years on the case carry a lingering sense of something unfinished every time the file is mentioned. So in the end, what are we looking at? A masterpiece of crime, planned with cold precision, exploiting every tiny crack in a massive system. Or a quiet indictment of airport security and the diamond industry where enormous wealth was balanced on the shoulders of people far too small. Maybe the answer lies in how each of us chooses to look at this story. What do you think? Was this the performance of brilliant criminal minds, or the failure of a system we all assumed could not be breached? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep diving into daring heists, costly security mistakes, and the lives pulled into them, stay tuned for the next video, where we break down a job even wilder than the Diamond Night in Brussels.